Hi, everybody. My name is Carl Darden, and I'd like to welcome and thank all of you for joining us today on Navy Sports Central. I'm your host, and this is the official podcast of the Navy Sports Nation, where we take a deeper dive into Navy sports. Well, unless you've just climbed out from under a rock, you'll know that Coach Ken Niumatalolo will not be back on the sidelines next season when Navy takes the field. The news that he was let go came immediately following Navy's heartbreaking loss to Army in double overtime. Those of you who know me also know that I'm a huge fan of Coach Ken, so when the news broke this past Monday morning, it felt like one big punch in the stomach. So we're going to get into that right after a quick sports update. We'll also have our question of the day and our Midwatch segment, so buckle up. There's a ton of stuff to talk about. Okay, glad to have you with us, everyone. Whether you are a returning listener or you're hearing us for the first time, thanks for making us part of your day. Obviously, there's a lot to get to in light of that bombshell news that Coach Ken Niumatalolo will not be coming back as Navy's head coach next year. But I don't want to overlook the other teams that have been getting it done lately for Navy. About a week after the last podcast was released, the Navy women's rugby team won their second straight CRAA Fall Division I title, and their first as a varsity program. The team took on Utah State in Charlotte, North Carolina on December the 4th, and they basically overwhelmed the Aggies by a score of 61-28. The Mids peaked at just the right time, too, because their record going into the tournament was an even 4-4, but they got things started with a tough 12-3 win over Air Force, and then followed that up with a 52-5 dismantling of Northeastern before defeating Utah State for the championship. It was a terrific win and also a great way for the team to make a splash in their first season as a varsity program. Next, I wanted to check in with the men's basketball team. Right now, they're sitting on a 6-4 record, having just come off an overtime win at Towson. One new player that you guys need to check out that's had a really big impact so far is freshman guard Austin Benini. He is from the Woodlands, Texas, just outside of Houston. And I'll tell you what, when this kid gets hot, you better watch out because he's going to pile up points in a hurry. Over the last 3 games, he's been averaging about 15 points, and that included one where he went off for 20 against West Virginia. I did watch part of that game, and he was looking really good, but unfortunately, the rest of the team was just a little bit flat, and the Mountaineers won easily. But in the Mids' last game against Towson, Benini chipped in with 10 points and helped put the game away in overtime by hitting 2 free throws to increase Navy's lead to 5 points. He also leads the team in field goal percentage at nearly 58% and is second on the team in assists behind Daniel Deaver with 32. The Mids' leading scorer is Tyler Nelson. He is a threat both inside and outside, while Deaver continues to display some terrific footwork in the paint to get his shot to go. And I continue to be impressed with his passing ability out of the high and low post. Coach DeChellis' crew has 2 more non-conference games before they begin their Patriot League schedule against Boston University on December 30th. One team we haven't mentioned in a while is the Navy Rifle team. They are off to a solid 8-4 start. That included a pretty strong showing in the President's Trophy competition held on November the 5th. That's the one where Army, Navy, Air Force, and the Coast Guard rifle teams go up against each other. Air Force ended up winning it just by like 14 points over the Mids, but Navy finished ahead of Army by a decent margin, and also the Coast Guard as well to take second. But they came through with big wins later in the month over NC State and Ohio State, so they look to be in really good shape once the season starts up again after the holidays. One of the Mids' best sharpshooters is sophomore Marley Duncan. She set all kinds of records last year, and right now she ranks second on the team in both the small bore and air rifle, and she leads the team in the average aggregate score for both events. The rifle team will be back at it in January when they begin their conference schedule against Akron. The indoor track season opened up on December the 3rd with the Navy Invitational. One of the top performers was Bramir Vick, who set a school record in the 60-meter hurdles. There were also a total of 26 IC4A qualifying marks posted, 18 by the men and 8 by the women. One of those 8 that the women put up was in the 400 meters by Molly Mangan. The senior captain clocked a time of 54.83 seconds, which was the 3rd fastest in the program's history. And by the way, for those of you who haven't heard it yet, Molly was my guest on the show last month, and she was just terrific, so I encourage you to check it out when you get a chance. She had some great perspective on what it's like to compete at Navy, and she also had some pretty funny stories, too. The name of the episode is Ending Bloodlines and Crushing the Competition, a conversation with Molly Mangan. So, again, check it out when you get a chance. And finally, I did want to quickly mention the Navy water polo team. They closed out their season with a couple of wins against Johns Hopkins and Wagner to finish 5th overall in what I believe was the 11-team Mid-Atlantic Water Polo Conference tournament. The one thing I didn't realize was how many games these guys play. Navy's record was 16-15, and it wasn't unusual for them to play 2 games on consecutive days or even 2 on the same day. And that to me is incredible because as far as I'm concerned, the only thing worse than having to swim and tread water for more than 5 minutes is having to do it when someone's trying to maul you as you're attempting to shoot the ball or pass it to a teammate. Those athletes to me are just incredible, and I just don't see how they do it. Anyway, I know there's somebody in our Facebook group who has a freshman son on the team, and I think I need to look her up because I did a feature on the water polo team last year for the blog, but it would be kind of cool to talk to someone who knows a little bit more about the sport than I do. And I've also thought about reaching out to the coach as well. Okay, that does it for the sports update. Coming up next, we have our deep dive segment, and I don't think you guys are going to want to miss this one. All right, we are back with our deep dive segment, and now we're going to spend quite a bit of time dissecting Navy Athletic Director Chet Gladchuk's decision to fire Coach Ken Niumatalolo immediately following the Army-Navy game. But I think to fully understand everything that went down, it's going to be important to have an appreciation for how we got to this point. So to do that, I'm going to start from when Gladchuk promoted Niumatalolo to the head coaching position on December 8th, 2007, following Paul Johnson's departure to Georgia Tech. So I'm going to go into kind of a storytelling mode here. The move to promote Coach Ken was easily one of the best decisions Gladchuk had made during his first 5 years on the job. I remember that press conference like it was yesterday. He stated that Navy was committed to the triple option because it was the biggest key to the team's success, and the best person to lead the team going forward was Coach Ken Niumatalolo. I agreed with Gladchuk 100%. Sure enough, the Mids never skipped a beat. They won the Commander-in-Chief Trophy during his first 2 years and 4 out of his first 6, and Niumatalolo's teams also beat Notre Dame 2 years in a row in 2009 and 2010. There was a hiccup in 2011 when the team went 5-7. They were actually 2 plays away from a 7-5 record and another Commander-in-Chief's trophy, but a quarterback who will remain nameless got flagged for taunting on a Navy touchdown in overtime against Air Force. That turned the extra point into a 36-yard attempt instead of a 21-yarder, and I think it was blocked. Then the Falcons scored a touchdown on their possession in overtime and got the point after for the win. Still, the Mids did beat Army for the 10th straight time, so the season did end on a positive note. During the next 4 years with Keenan Reynolds at quarterback, it was the best stretch of Navy football in recent memory. They went 35-13, won 3 Commander-in-Chief's trophies, 3 bowl games, and extended their winning streak against Army to 14. 2015 was also Navy's first year in the American Conference, and they ended up winning a share of the Western Division title right off the bat. 2016 and 2017 were both winning seasons, but a huge injury to Will Worth in the AAC championship game in 2016 resulted in third-string quarterback Zach Abey starting the Army game, and the Mids still nearly pulled off the win. So that record-breaking winning streak was finally over. The 2017 season started off great until a rash of injuries destroyed the defense. Still, the Mids made it to bowl season where they overwhelmed the University of Virginia 49-7. The 2018 season was ugly. There's just no other way to put that. The team limped home with a 3-10 record. The quarterback situation never got settled, and the offensive line suffered from inconsistent play all year. A third straight loss of Army didn't help, and now there's some grumbling among the fans about the state of the program. But 2019 was another record-setting year. Malcolm Perry committed to being the quarterback and worked his tail off during the offseason. The result was an eye-popping 2017 rushing yards for the year, another 11-2 record, another Commander-in-Chief's trophy, and a signature win over Kansas State in the Liberty Bowl. Then came the pandemic, and everything changed. It all began with a talent gap at quarterback. No realistic fan was expecting to see anyone like Reynolds or Perry taking the field right away, but there was a drop-off that proved too big to overcome. The other issue was the COVID restrictions. The incoming class of 2023 was not allowed to practice with the team until the season started, so that impacted quarterback development in a major way. 2 games were canceled, including a likely win, and the team stumbled to a 3-7 record in 2020. There are also a couple of occasions throughout the year when the entire Naval Academy was locked down as part of the COVID restrictions. Players were also tested every day, and for some, it just proved to be a little bit too much. Another factor that had a devastating effect on the team was the college transfer portal. It was introduced to make the process of an athlete going to another school more transparent, and because of the pandemic, the NCAA granted an additional year of eligibility to those college athletes whose careers were severely impacted. Navy did not allow its players to take advantage of this policy. Army and Air Force did. Shortly after that, key recruits from the class of 23 began to leave. 32 of those 57 recruits were no longer wearing a Navy uniform. Some just stopped playing football altogether. Most of them continued their careers at other schools, and several, like Will Hodges, who is a starting linebacker at TCU, are with some really good Power 5 programs. Things did get somewhat back to normal last season in terms of the routine, but there was still a huge experience void. The class of 22 had about the same number leave the program as well, and when the injuries started piling up, most of the starters were sophomores and juniors. The team took a lot of hits early, the offensive line was inexperienced, Ty Levitai had emerged as a starter and was hurt in the very first game. He did come back to lead the team to a huge win over Central Florida and capped off his sophomore year with a monster upset win over Army. The Mids finished 4-8, playing the third toughest schedule in the nation, so going into 2022, there was a reason to feel a little bit optimistic. But the opening day loss to Delaware really got the team off to a bad start. The offense never got into gear, but the team slowly improved and was sitting on a 2-3 record going into the SMU game. That one was definitely winnable, but the Mids fell behind by 2 scores following a turnover in the second half and just couldn't catch up. The final score was 40-34. I felt they needed that game to have a legitimate shot at a 6-6 record. It would take upsets over Houston and Central Florida plus wins over Temple and Army to get there now. The loss to Houston ended any hope of that. They did beat Temple, but paid a heavy price when Ty Levitai was lost for the season with a torn ACL. Now, Xavier Ireland came in and did a nice job to secure the win in overtime against the Owls, but then came 2 hard-fought losses against Cincinnati and Notre Dame. The Mids actually played pretty well in both of those games. So I did give them a chance to beat Central Florida, who was ranked 20th or 17th, depending on the poll that you looked at, and it turned out to be another great effort by the defense. On offense, Arline did what he needed to do to lift the team to an awesome win, and the Mids had some good momentum heading into the Army game. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of the game itself, other than to say that, as usual, it came down to a couple of possessions. The outcome was disappointing enough, but when I got the notification the next day that Coach Ken had been let go, I was both shocked and not surprised at the same time, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. I was shocked because I figured it made sense to give Coach Ken one more year to see how things shook out. 18 of Navy's 22 starters were set to return. The defense was primed to be lights out after having another solid year with such a young unit. The success of the offense would come down to who was under center. Assuming Levitai makes a full recovery, he's the odds-on favorite. Of course, Arline is in the mix too, and it's also possible that a quarterback from the class of 2024 could challenge for the job. Either way, the offense had plenty of firepower returning, and I thought Coach Ken deserved a chance to finish out his contract. So that's the main reason the decision to let Coach Niumatalolo go shocked me. But when we come back, I'll get into the reasons why it didn't necessarily surprise me. Stay with us. Okay, thanks for staying with us on Navy Sports Central. Carl Darden here with you, and we are continuing our discussion on the decision not to bring back Coach Ken Niumatalolo for a 16th season at Navy. You've just heard a brief history on everything that's happened up to this point. And as we went into the break, you heard the reasons why I found this decision to be pretty shocking. Now I'm going to tell you why I didn't find it all that surprising. And to do that, I'm going to back up about 10 years and relate a personal story that I think you guys might find interesting. In the summer of 2012, I was back at the academy going through a couple of days of refresher training for blue and gold officers. For those of you who may not know, they are men and women, as well as some Navy reservists, who work with the Candidate Guidance Office to interview qualified candidates for the Naval Academy. Anyway, I was sitting in King Hall eating lunch with the other BGOs in the group on the second day of the training, and eventually the conversation turned to football. The Mids were getting set for summer practices, and it was after their first losing season in 10 years. They'd finished 5-7, as I'd mentioned before, in 2011, but the season did end on a positive note when they beat Army 26-21. Anyway, the guy sitting next to me, who was from the class of 64, I think, says to me, "Well, I think Navy's best days are behind them. I see us sliding back into mediocrity just like before Coach Johnson was hired." And I looked at him, and I quite honestly thought he was on crack. So I said, "Look, I'm not sure what you mean. Yeah, the team did underachieve a little bit, but they were 2 plays away from being 7-5 instead of 5-7. Coach Niumatalolo's teams have beat Notre Dame twice in a row in 2009 and 2010. They destroyed Missouri in a bowl game in 2009, and they won the Commander-in-Chief's trophy his first 2 years." Then he comes back and he says to me, "Yeah, but he did all that with Coach Johnson's recruits." And that's when I almost choked on whatever I was eating. I looked at the guy like he was from another planet, and mustering every bit of self-control I had, I told him this. Look, that might be true had Coach Niumatalolo been hired from outside the program. But he came to Navy with Paul Johnson in 2002, And as the assistant coach, he was responsible for recruiting, primarily the offensive line. So all of those seasons that the Mids were among the top rushing teams in the nation was because of the players Coach Ken brought in. That was his area of responsibility, and his performance was judged partly on how many of his recruits contributed significantly to the program. It's true that those players were recruited while Paul Johnson was the coach, but it was Niumatalolo who actually did the recruiting, at least where the offensive line was concerned. He also managed to hold on to 8 of the other coaches who came with Coach Johnson, and they were all strong recruiters as well. So I think your prediction of the football program sliding backwards these next few years is way off base. He didn't say another word, and we all know what happened after that. The next 4 years ranked as the most successful in Navy football history. This past Sunday, I actually thought back to that conversation, and I came to the conclusion that if this guy felt the program was headed south that quickly under Coach Ken 10 years ago, there were others who probably felt the same way. And I'm not talking about your average Navy fan or even your average member of the Alumni Association like me. I'm talking about those ones with really deep pockets. So it's not unreasonable for me to think that there might be other people out there who just want to see their guy leading the program. Now, let's assume that that's the case. The only trouble with what they wanted was that Niumatalolo kept on winning. And then, when Navy lost to Army for the 3rd straight time, I started to hear some noise about where the program was headed among the average Navy fans. So I'm thinking the same conversations were being had among the big donors as well. But that record-breaking 2019 season quieted things down again for the time being. Now, these past 3 seasons have been disappointing to say the least, but in fairness, the circumstances have been pretty incredible. The class of 22 and 23 lost over 50% of their recruits during the pandemic. This was partly due to the tight COVID restrictions as well. Those were just too much for the players to deal with, and I totally get that. So now, half the bench strength has been wiped out from 2 recruiting classes, and to add insult to injury, Navy had one of the top 3 toughest schedules to play the last 2 years in a row. The Secretary of the Navy denied the Mids the opportunity to have another year of eligibility that the NCAA granted due to COVID, and I didn't even have a problem with that until I found out that Army and Air Force figured out a way to make that happen. So now, the playing field has been tilted, and the expectations remain the same. At this point, I was a fan just wanting to weather the storm. Let's just get through the 2022 season, the worst will be behind us, and we'll see if Coach Ken can get things back on track in 2023. And by the way, that's all he was asking for a chance to do. Here's a guy who was responsible for the most wins ever in the history of the program during his tenure. He had a 10-5 record over Army and brought home 6 Commander-in-Chief's trophies and a share of the 7th one in 2021 after pulling off a huge upset over the Black Knights. Coach Ken even came out and said he would quit if he couldn't get things squared away. That's the kind of man he is. For my money, no one does a better job of holding himself accountable. Next year, most of his starters would be coming back. The schedule wouldn't be quite as difficult as it had been the last 2 seasons. It would have been the perfect opportunity to see if he could get things done. And if not, he and the academy would just shake hands and part company. Now, clearly things didn't work out that way, and I guess more than anything else, I'm extremely disappointed in how everything went sideways so quickly. And like all of you who follow the program closely, it all goes back to the Air Force game in 2021. In that game, the Mids just couldn't get anything going offensively. It was just too tough to watch. The defense kept them in the game all the way until basically the middle of I would say probably the beginning of the 4th quarter, and then they just ran out of gas. The final score was 23-3, but it wasn't so much that the Mids had lost to the Falcons. I mean, the series had been basically even for the previous 10 years. But it was the first time since 2011 that Navy had lost at home, and it wasn't even that close. Less than 2 hours after the game was over, I got this notification saying that Gladchuck had fired Navy offensive coordinator Ivan Jasper, and I was completely speechless. First of all, I'd never heard of an athletic director firing anyone other than a head coach. Now, I'm not saying he didn't have the right to do that, but firing a member of the staff was typically the head coach's job, not the AD. The only exception might be if the AD decided to clean house altogether, and that wasn't the case here. Anyway, Coach Ken intervened, and after meeting with Gladchuck, Coach Jasper was brought back as a quarterback's coach. But from that point forward, I didn't think things were ever going to be the same between Niumatalolo and Gladchuck. I guess my question is, why exactly did Gladchuck make the decision to fire Coach Jasper without talking to Coach Niumatalolo first? Did he come to it on his own? Or were there some other highly influential alumni involved in the decision? Look, I get the frustration. The Mids were pretty inexperienced on offense. Lavatai was hurt in the first game of the season against Marshall, so he wasn't even playing against Air Force. It was Xavier Arline, who is an exceptional runner, but didn't have the same passing ability as Lavatai does. And as a result, they were never really in a game offensively. And that's tough to deal with in a rivalry game. As far as I'm concerned, how Gladchuck came to that decision doesn't matter. I'm not even saying he didn't have the right to fire Jasper. What I'm saying is the proper thing to do is to sit down and have a discussion with Coach Niumatalolo before making any kind of change. then the coach would have been the one delivering the news instead of Gladchuk. That's just leadership 101. In any relationship, whether it's personal or professional, trust is the foundation. And once a crack develops there, it's tough to keep it from spreading and bringing everything down. Now, I can't prove it, but if I had to make an educated guess, I would say that following that meeting with Gladchuk in 2021 after the Air Force game, Coach Ken might have punched the mental clock that began ticking down the time he had planned to remain coaching at the Naval Academy. And that likely would have been at the end of the 2023 season when his contract was up. Now, this past Monday, Gladchuk had a press conference where he took questions about Coach Ken's dismissal as well as the path forward. And during that time, he reviewed the expectations. Number one was win the Commander-in-Chief's trophy, and the next was to get at least 6 wins to qualify for a bowl game. Those expectations have been very clear, and they haven't changed. And Gladchuk made a point of emphasizing that. And you know what? He's right. I'm in total agreement with those goals and expectations. They are very reasonable under normal circumstances. The only problem is that the last 3 seasons have been nowhere close to normal. And here's an analogy that I think fits pretty well. Let's suppose you're the leader of a top-producing sales team. There were a couple of off sales cycles in the last 15 years, but for the most part, your group has exceeded expectations way more often than not. And the past year saw the team break all kinds of records. Then a major recession hits and you lose half of your sales team. Many of them were top performers who chose to explore other opportunities, and then others just decided to get out of the industry altogether. At the same time, your director comes to you and explains that there will be a 2-year hiring freeze, but your sales goals will not be changing. You also learn that 2 of your competitors have figured out a way to expand their sales teams, and they will therefore have a significant advantage in your marketplace until things change for the better. Nevertheless, it's pretty clear to you that if you don't produce at the same rate despite what you've had to deal with, your days with the company are numbered. Now, I get that this analogy isn't dead on. I mean, the Mids do have 3 additional classes, those being 24 through 26, that have come in since the pandemic started. And some of them have had a strong impact. But the core of the team, going back to a couple of seasons ago, was being formed by the classes of 22 and 23. And those were the ones that were gutted by the players entering the transfer portal or just ending their playing careers altogether. That makes it really tough to produce wins to remain bowl eligible, especially in the American Conference, which is super competitive. Now, as I mentioned before, both Army and Air Force figured out a way to take advantage of the NCAA's rule to grant an extra year of eligibility to those players affected by the pandemic. When it was discovered that Navy would not have the same opportunity, the scales tipped in a big way. Oh yeah, and just as an aside, I guess Air Force decided to go outside the lines anyway because they just got hit with an NCAA violation and they're on probation for the next 2 years. My point is these were extraordinary circumstances. As the athletic director, Gladchuk had a right to be frustrated, as we all did. But when he said that Air Force played by the same rules, he was just flat out wrong. And more than anything else, it really bothered me how he delivered the news to Coach Niumatalolo. That's the part that didn't surprise me, though. I mean, he fired the offensive coordinator last year without consulting his own head coach. That's not normal. I don't care what anybody says. It was only after Niumatalolo intervened that Coach Jasper was brought back to focus on developing the quarterbacks. So if Gladchuk was capable of that, the fact that he would fire the most successful coach in the history of the program within hours after a painful loss in double overtime to our biggest rival isn't that big of a stretch. And before I go any further, I do want to stress that I'm on record as saying that Gladchuk has hired some of the best coaches that Navy Athletics has. After hiring Coach Niumatalolo to replace Coach Johnson in 2007, Gladchuk has also hit a home run by hiring Cindy Timchall, the Navy women's lacrosse coach, Jamie Cook, who is the director of Navy track and field, and also Carrie Colott, who took over a couple of years ago as the Navy wrestling coach. I don't doubt for 1 second that Gladchuk has the best interests of the Naval Academy in mind, but when you consider how much Coach Ken has done for this program, he deserved better, and you'd be hard-pressed to convince me otherwise. Given the circumstances, I didn't really see any downside to letting him finish out his contract next year. The Academy has to pay him anyway, so it doesn't seem all that unreasonable to give him one last shot based on the high number of starters returning and the less challenging schedule. Besides, I think he would have left anyway even if the Mids were to bounce back and win another Commander-in-Chief's trophy. My gut tells me that what happened after last year's Air Force game changed the relationship between Niumatalolo and Gladchuk forever. Now the program moves on. In his press conference, Gladchuk did say he was committed to staying with the triple option, but he also said he would consider a defensive-minded coach like current defensive coordinator Brian Newberry as long as he hired an option-oriented offensive coordinator. There are a lot of thought-provoking candidates based on what I read in an article written by Bill Wagner of the Capital Gazette. He uncovered that former Penn State and Houston Texans coach Bill O'Brien had expressed an interest. The same goes for former BYU and UVA coach Bronco Mendenhall. 2 names with option experience also came up. The first was Brian Bohannon at Kennesaw State. Coach Newberry was the defensive coordinator there prior to coming to Navy. And the other was Air Force offensive coordinator Mike Thiessen. He's been with the Falcons for 16 years, which is when Troy Calhoun took over as head coach. Thiessen is also a former quarterback at Air Force, but even if Gladchuk could pull him away, my feeling is that he would head right back to Air Force if Calhoun decided to move on. Wagner even said that Coach Paul Johnson hasn't ruled out returning to coaching, but I don't know how likely it would be that he will return to Navy. The bottom line is I have no idea who will wind up getting hired, but I'm rooting for Coach Newberry. First, I think he's earned a shot at the job based on what he's done with the defense over the last 4 years. And I think he's connected enough to track down a really good option-oriented offensive coordinator. Maybe Bohanna would come over in that capacity, but I'd be a little surprised. He might just decide to wait for another head coaching opportunity. Bohannon has had good success at Kennesaw State, but the team struggled a little bit this year, going 5-6. So I guess all we can do right now is wait and see what happens. Okay, that gets you guys all up to speed on what's going on with the Navy coaching situation. So we're going to take a short break. This is Carl Darden, and you're listening to Navy Sports Central. All right, it is time to roll into our question of the day. But before we do that, I wanted to give you a heads up on something. A couple of months ago, I was invited to be a guest on a podcast called What I Meant to Say, hosted by Wendy Jones. And I had an absolutely terrific time visiting with her. So I'd like to introduce you to her and invite you to check out her podcast. Wendy has a wide range of guests, and her shows are all pretty uplifting. And there's no doubt we can all use more of that now. So here's Wendy.
Hi, I'm Wendy Jones, the founder of Be Better Media and host of the What I Meant to Say podcast. If you're enjoying this Navy Sports Central podcast hosted by Carl Darden, I would be honored to have you check out What I Meant to Say. Starting with the conversation I had with Carl, you'll find a space to connect with sports stories and more that make you believe in yourself and your own potential. Check us out at BeBetterMedia.tv and What I Meant to Say, streaming now on all major podcast platforms.
So again, that was Wendy Jones, the host of the podcast What I Meant to Say. Seriously, if you're looking for another one to check out, I highly recommend that one. And like I said before, I had a great time talking with Wendy, and I'll go ahead and put a link to her podcast in the show notes. Now let's go ahead and jump into our question of the day. And as always, we'll check out the responses to the question from our last show. In that episode, Jim Keneally joined me to recap the Navy Sprint football team's championship season. And the question was, the College Sprint Football League has been around since 1934. How many times has Navy either shared the CSFL championship or won it outright since they joined the league in 1946? Is it A, 34 times, B, 37 times, C, 39 times, or D, 40 times? So on this one, 9% of you went with 40 times, which was close. Then 10% picked 34 times, 4% of you chose 37 times, and a whopping 77% of you came in with the correct answer, which is 39 times. And that's the most championships any team in the College Sprint Football League has won. Army is in second place with 37 championships, by the way. And there was no championship game played during the 2020 COVID season. Now I'm going to go ahead and give you our question of the day for this episode. Coach Ken Niumatalolo has had the longest and most successful run in the history of the Navy football program. And in my mind, his greatest accomplishment is the tremendous impact he's had on so many players when it comes to their development as leaders. As far as I'm concerned, that supersedes everything else. But let's focus on his on-the-field accomplishments for this one. And by the way, there's no right answer here. Here's the question. Which one of these Navy wins under Coach Niumatalolo stands out to you as both the most memorable and or unlikely? A, crushing Notre Dame 35-17 in 2010 for the second year in a row. B, beating 6th-ranked Houston in 2016 with a quarterback in Will Worth who was only making his fourth start. C, defeating Kansas State in the Liberty Bowl 20-17 to cap off another record-breaking season at 11-2 in 2019. Or D, taking down Army 17-13 in 2021 despite being a 7.5-point underdog. I'm going to go ahead and post this question on the Navy Sports Nation group Facebook page by the end of the day. You can give me your answer there if you are a member of the page, or you can email me at carld@navysportsnation.com. And again, if you're not yet a member of the Navy Sports Nation group on Facebook, I'd encourage you to join. It's really a lot of fun. Just type in Navy Sports Nation in the search box and the group should come up. There are a couple of questions you need to answer because it is a private group. But if you go ahead and knock those out, I'll approve the request. All right, now we're going to close this episode with our Midwatch segment. We are into the winter sports season, and on our last show, I said we were going to start tracking a couple of swimmers. So, on the men's side, we're going to be following Jonah Harm. He is a junior from Placerville, California. Harm broke his own school and league record in the 100 butterfly when he posted a time of 46.19 seconds in the championship final of the event at the Purdue Invitational. That time earned him a second-place finish just 0.02 of a second behind the winner. Harm also won the 100 butterfly against Army a couple of weeks ago, shaving nearly 0.4 of a second off his school record, but it wasn't enough to stop the Black Knights from finally ending that 31-year losing streak to the mids. In fact, they almost pulled it off last year in Annapolis, so you know they were targeting that meet. And this year's outcome was definitely a tough one, but I'm sure the men will be ready to go when the Patriot League Championships roll around in February. Now, the swimmer we'll be following for the women will be Lauren Walsh from Shelton, Connecticut. She's only a freshman, and she earned Patriot League honors for her performance in the Ohio State Invitational. Walsh swam an NCAA qualifying time of 1:59.41 in the 200 individual medley, and she also won the same event with a time of 2 minutes 0.5 seconds to help the women defeat Army for the 34th straight time. That ranks as the longest streak in Army-Navy history. So, based on what she's accomplished so far, we could be seeing Walsh's name all over the record books over the next 3 years. That's going to do it for this edition of Navy Sports Central. Thank you all so much for joining us. Now, if you like what you've heard, be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and remember to spread the word to all the other Navy fans out there. We have been getting a great response to our question of the day, so if you want to jump in on that, just go to the Navy Sports Nation group Facebook page. I will go ahead and pin it to the top so you won't miss it. And just a quick reminder, the views expressed on Navy Sports Central are my own and do not reflect those of the U.S. Naval Academy or Navy Athletics. By the way, the music used in Navy Sports Central comes to you courtesy of Audio Jungle. This is a great site for purchasing the rights to use music from thousands of artists around the world, and those we feature in the podcast will be credited in our show notes. Talk to you soon, everybody. Until next time, this is Carl Darden. Go Navy, beat Army.